Week 5. The 5th week began with silence, not the peaceful silence of a calm sea, nor the welcome silence that followed a storm. It was the silence that settles over people who've grown accustomed to suffering. The conversations that had filled the hold during the first days of the voyage had almost disappeared. No one asked how much further there was to America. No one wondered aloud what work they might find. The Atlantic had reduced life to simpler questions. Who was still healthy? Who had enough strength to climb onto the deck? Who would still be alive next week? For Michael and Mary, there was only one question that mattered. Would little Mary Jr. survive? The fever had never truly left her. It rose and fell like the ocean itself. One morning she would seem slightly stronger, asking for a sip of water or opening her eyes long enough to recognize her mother. By evening she would drift once more into a restless sleep, her breathing shallow and uneven. Her cough had changed. It was no longer the sharp cough of a child fighting a cold. It had become deep and rattling, as though every breath had to struggle through water. Mary scarcely left her side. She no longer cared how untidy her own appearance had become. Her hair, once carefully braided each morning, now hung loose about her face. Dark circles had formed beneath her eyes. She measured time not by sunrise or sunset, but by each breath her daughter managed to take. Michael tried to remain hopeful. He fetched water. He softened biscuits that Mary herself no longer had the appetite to eat. He carried little Mary Jr. onto the deck whenever the weather allowed, hoping the fresh air might somehow strengthen her lungs. The child no longer pointed excitedly at the waves. She simply rested against his shoulder. Her small arms, once wrapped tightly round his neck, now hung limply at her sides. The ship's surgeon visited twice each day. Each visit lasted only a few minutes. He listened to her chest, counted her breaths, felt her pulse. Her face betrayed little emotion, but Michael noticed the pauses growing longer. On Wednesday afternoon, the surgeon quietly motioned for Michael to follow him outside the hold. They climbed onto the main deck, where the wind carried away the sound of coughing below. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, the surgeon removed his spectacles. "I owe you the truth." Michael nodded. "I'd expect nothing less." "The infection has settled deep in her lungs." Michael stared at the deck beneath his feet. "Can you stop it?" The surgeon shook his head. "If we were ashore, even then I would have little to offer. Here?" He glanced towards the hatch leading below. "I've almost nothing." "There must be something." "I've done all I can." Michael swallowed hard. "So now what?" The surgeon's voice softened. "Now we keep her comfortable." Michael had heard those words before. Back in Kerry, when neighbours had been dying during the famine, he knew what they often meant. The news spread quietly through the passengers. No announcement was made. None was needed. People living so closely together could read grief on one another's faces. That evening, an elderly woman named Mrs. Flaherty approached Mary, carrying a tiny cloth bundle. "I made this for my granddaughter years ago," she said. Inside was a small rag doll, no more than 6 inches tall, stitched from scraps of faded blue fabric. My granddaughter didn't live to keep it. Mary looked at the doll, then at the woman. "I couldn't." "You can." Mrs. Flaherty gently placed it beside little Mary Jr. "Perhaps she'll hold it." The little girl did. Her fingers barely closed around the doll's cloth arm, but they held fast. Mary broke down in tears. It was the first time she had cried since leaving Ireland. Around her, several women quietly wept with her. No words could improve the situation. Sometimes sharing another person's sorrow was all anyone had left to give. Brandon and Sean had become unusually quiet. The rough games they once played on deck had stopped. Instead, they sat beside their sister, telling her stories about the farm in Kerry. They reminded her of the old apple tree near the cottage, the stream where they caught tiny fish, the neighbour's sheep that had once wandered into their vegetable patch. Sean even promised that when they reached America, he would build her a swing. "You'll like that," he whispered. "You can swing higher than the birds." Little Mary Jr.'s eyes fluttered open for a moment. She managed the faintest hint of a smile. It disappeared almost immediately as another coughing fit took over her. Food had become almost meaningless to Mary. She pushed her own bowl towards Brandon one evening. "I'm not hungry." Michael quickly divided it between the boys. He knew she needed the strength as much as anyone, but he also knew there was no point arguing. Parents had always gone hungry before letting their children do the same. That instinct remained unchanged, even here. Another burial took place on Thursday, then another on Saturday. The passengers no longer crowded the rails as they had during the first funeral. Instead, they watched quietly from where they stood. Death, though never ordinary, had become familiar. The captain had begun keeping a careful list in his logbook, each name, each age, each date. Simple entries that could never capture the lives behind them. Future generations might read those records and count the dead. Only those aboard this ship would remember their voices. Late on Friday night, Mary awoke to an alarming stillness. For one moment she thought her daughter had died. Then she noticed a tiny rise and fall of her chest. The breathing was slower now, far slower. Each breath was separated by several long seconds. Mary shook Michael awake. "I don't think she's going to last the night." He sat beside them, shaking his daughter's tiny hand. It was frighteningly light, as though the illness had carried away not only her strength, but her very substance. Brandon stirred in his sleep. Sean rolled over. Neither boy yet understood what was happening. Michael looked at his wife. "We should wake them." Mary hesitated. "Should we? I think they'll want to say goodbye if—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Brandon and Sean climbed silently onto the berth. Brandon reached for his little sister's hand. Sean carefully tucked the little rag doll beneath her arm. "I'll still build the swing," he whispered. "You'll see." No one corrected him. Dawn arrived with a pale ribbon of light slipping through the hatch. Little Mary Jr. was still alive, but only just. The surgeon examined her once more. He listened for a long time before standing. "She's still with us." Mary searched his face for encouragement. Instead, she found compassion. "I don't believe she'll remain in pain much longer." It was a strange comfort, not hope of recovery, but hope that suffering would end soon. Michael carried his daughter onto the deck one final time. The Atlantic lay calm beneath a sky of brilliant blue. He wrapped a blanket around her and held her close, letting the morning sun warm her face. For the first time in days, she opened her eyes fully. She looked towards the endless sea, then up at her father. Her lips moved. He leaned closer. "So pretty." They were the last words anyone heard her speak. As the 5th week came to an end, the O'Sullivan family clung desperately to the smallest thread of hope. America was still somewhere beyond the western horizon, but for Michael and Mary, the entire world had become no larger than the frail little girl sleeping in her father's arms. The voyage continued, time moved forward, and somewhere below deck the ship's carpenter quietly began measuring a piece of spare canvas. No one said why. No one needed to. The 6th week began just before dawn. The ship drifted through a blanket of fog so thick that even the sailors on watch could scarcely see from bow to stern. The mournful tolling of the ship's bell echoed across the Atlantic every few minutes, warning unseen vessels of their presence. Deep below deck, however, no one noticed the fog. Every thought in the O'Sullivan family's berth was fixed upon one small child. Little Mary Jr.'s breathing had become so faint that Mary found herself leaning close every few moments, terrified she would no longer hear it. The fever had burned for nearly 3 weeks. It had consumed her strength piece by piece. Her cheeks were hollow now. Her little hands, once so eager to grasp her mother's fingers, lay motionless upon the blanket. The rag doll Mrs. Flaherty had given her remained tucked beneath one arm. Mary had not moved it. It somehow made the child appear less alone. Michael had not slept properly in days. Each time exhaustion closed his eyes, he awoke with a start, afraid that the moment he stopped watching would be the moment he lost his daughter. Brandon and Sean understood far more than their parents realized. Children often did. They whispered to one another instead of playing. They no longer asked when they would reach America. They no longer complained about the food. Even their hunger seemed less important. Every morning, Brandon quietly fetched the family's water ration. Sean carefully folded the blankets. Neither boy had been asked. They simply did what they thought might help. The ship surgeon arrived early after sunrise. He knelt beneath the berth and gently placed 2 fingers upon Mary Jr.'s wrist. He waited, then moved his hand to her neck. He listened to her chest. Finally, he closed his medical bag without saying a word. Michael looked at him. Is there anything?" The surgeon lowered his eyes. "I don't believe she'll see another sunset." Mary bowed her head but did not cry. She had cried until there were no more tears left. Now she simply took her daughter's hand and began quietly singing an old Irish lullaby she had sung since the child was born. The melody floated softly throughout the crowded hold. One by one, nearby conversations stopped. Even those who did not know the family recognized what was happening. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Passengers moved quietly around the O'Sullivans, giving them as much privacy as could possibly exist in a room shared by hundreds of people. Mrs. Flaherty sat beside Mary for several hours without speaking. Sometimes companionship required no words. The priest visited in the afternoon. He offered a prayer for the child and another for the family. Michael listened respectfully. Whether the words reached heaven he could not know, but they reached him. For a few moments they eased a burden he could no longer carry. As evening approached, the fog finally lifted. Golden sunlight spilled across the Atlantic, turning the water to molten copper. Michael asked the captain for permission to bring his daughter onto deck one last time. The captain nodded silently. No rules were spoken. None were needed. Wrapped in Mary's shawl, little Mary Jr. was carried into the fresh evening air. Brandon walked on one side. Sean held tightly to his mother's hand. The family stood together near the stern. The sea was calm. A gentle breeze stirred the child's pale hair. Mary kissed her forehead. "You were always my brave little girl." Michael rested one rough hand upon the blanket. "I promised you a better life." His voice faltered. "I'm sorry." No one answered. There was nothing anyone could say. Just as the sun touched the western horizon, Mary Jr.'s breathing slowed once more. One breath. A long pause. Another breath. Longer still. Mary held her daughter close, gently rocking as she had done countless nights back in County Kerry. Then, without struggle, without fear, the little girl's breathing simply stopped. Mary waited. Surely another breath would come. She leaned close. Nothing. She looked desperately towards the surgeon, who had quietly joined them. He stepped forward, placed 2 fingers lightly against the child's neck, and after several moments he slowly removed his hand. Then with great tenderness he pulled Michael's cap from his own head. It was all the confirmation anyone needed. Mary buried her face against her daughter's hair. A sound escaped her unlike anything Michael had ever heard before. It was not a cry, not quite. It was the sound of a mother's heart breaking. Brandon stood perfectly still. He had imagined this moment 100 times during the previous week. None of those imaginings had prepared him. Sean began to sob uncontrollably. "I said I'd build you a swing," he cried. "I said I would." Michael gathered both boys into his arms while Mary continued holding the little girl she could no longer comfort. The Atlantic rolled gently onward, indifferent to the grief unfolding upon its deck. Word spread quickly throughout the ship. Passengers removed their hats as the family walked back below. Several women embraced Mary. Others quietly crossed themselves. The crew, hardened by years at sea, spoke in whispers. Even the captain lingered outside the family's berth for a moment before moving on. Death had become familiar aboard the vessel. The death of a child never did. The following morning the sea burial took place. Unlike the hurried ceremonies that the necessity sometimes demanded, the captain delayed the ship's routine for nearly half an hour. Every passenger who was able gathered on deck. The child had been wrapped carefully in clean canvas. Mary had insisted that the little rag doll remain beside her. The crew honoured the request. The tiny bundle was so small that Brandon could scarcely bear to look at it. The priest read the scriptures. His voice trembled for the first time since the voyage had begun. When he finished, he looked toward Michael. "Would you like to say anything?" Michael stared at the canvas bundle. For several moments he could not speak. Finally, he managed only a few words. "She never hurt anyone." He swallowed hard. "She deserved to grow up." Silence followed. No speech could improve upon the truth of those 2 sentences. 2 sailors gently lifted the small bundle to the ship's rail. Mary reached out one last time, her fingertips brushing the canvas. "I love you," she whispered. Then the sailors released it. The bundle slipped quietly beneath the waves. For a few fleeting seconds it remained visible beneath the clear Atlantic water. Then the ocean closed above it. The ripples spread outward and disappeared. There was no marker, no grave, no place the family could ever return to. Only a memory that carried forever in the hearts of those who loved her. The days that followed passed in a strange haze. Mary scarcely spoke. She remained on her berth, staring at the empty space where her daughter had slept. Sometimes she reached instinctively for a child who was no longer there. Then she remembered, and her hand slowly fell back into her lap. Brandon carefully folded the little blanket that had belonged to his sister. Sean refused to let anyone touch the tiny wooden cup she had used for drinking. Michael spent long hours alone on deck, watching the endless horizon. He had left Ireland believing the worst was behind them. Now he understood that suffering had crossed the ocean with them. Yet the ship continued west. The sails remained full. The waves continued their endless rhythm. Life aboard the Coffin Ship allowed little time for grief. Meals were still served. The sick still needed tending. The pumps still had to be worked. The living still had to survive. As the 6th week drew to its close, the O'Sullivan family gathered together in the darkness of the hold. There were now only 4 of them. The empty place beside Mary seemed larger than the berth itself. Ahead lay 6 more weeks of ocean. Behind them, somewhere beneath thousands of feet of Atlantic water, rested the smallest member of their family. America was growing closer with every passing day, but for Michael, Mary, Brandon, and Sean, it would never again feel like the journey they had begun together.